I was on my usual route, driving the bus, ferrying a gaggle of kids from their homes to the school. They were as lively as ever, chattering, laughing, and occasionally bickering over who got which seat. The air smelt faintly of crayons and the packed lunches stuffed into their backpacks. I didn't think twice about the day ahead. Why would I? The morning unfolded without issue. I remember the sun breaking through the clouds as we wound through the rural roads towards the school. Some of the younger kids were singing songs while the older ones slumped in their seats staring at their phones. The last thing I clearly recall is driving through the wooded stretch of road about 10 minutes from the school. Then it's just nothing. A blank space in my memory where the day should have been. No bumps, no screeching tires, no flash of light or sudden impact. One moment, I was there. The next, it was like waking up from a deep sleep. When my mind seemed to pick back up, the bus was pulling into the school car park. The kids were laughing and chatting as if no time had passed, but I felt disoriented, as though I'd just come out of a long nap I didn't remember taking. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe the monotony of the route had lulled me into some kind of autopilot trance. But as soon as the kids stepped off the bus, everything went sideways. Their phones started buzzing, all of them at once. I could hear the frantic chimes and vibrations from the driver's seat. The kids' laughter turned to confused murmurs, then panic. I looked in the mirror and saw their faces twisting in disbelief as they stared at their screens. One by one, they pulled out their phones and saw what I couldn't ignore: dozens of missed calls and frantic texts from their parents. The teachers standing outside looked just as confused. Some of them had been clutching their phones too, and when they saw the bus pull up, their expressions turned pale. They rushed forward, some yelling, some just staring, wide-eyed and frozen. I could see it all from my seat. The kids crying, holding up their phones and showing messages to the teachers. The teachers started pulling kids aside, trying to calm them down. I finally stepped off the bus, needing answers as much as anyone else. That's when I overheard the words that made my stomach drop. We'd been missing for 3 days. 3 days. I was shaking as I pieced together what they were saying. Parents had been frantic, reporting the bus missing when it never arrived at the school that morning. Search parties had scoured the area looking for any sign of us. News stations had picked up the story. But we hadn't been found. Not until now. And none of us, me, the kids, anyone, had any memory of those 3 missing days. To us, it felt like we'd taken the usual 40-minute drive from the first stop to the school. It was seamless, like no time had passed at all. Police officers arrived not long after, asking questions that no one could answer. Where had we been? Why hadn't we called for help? How could an entire bus full of children and a driver vanish without a trace and reappear as if nothing had happened? The bus itself didn't offer any clues. The tank was still full of fuel, the engine was running fine, and there was no evidence of tampering or mechanical failure. The GPS tracker installed in the vehicle had mysteriously gone dark during the missing period and only activated again moments before we pulled into the school car park. The kids were sent home with their parents, but I could see the looks on everyone's faces. The parents hugged their children tightly, some crying, others just holding on like they were afraid to let go. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to the wooded stretch of road where my memory had gone blank. I've driven that route for years and never thought twice about it. But now, the thought of going back there fills me with fear. The most unsettling part is the bus itself. It's parked in the depot now, and I can't bring myself to get near it. The other drivers have been avoiding it too. I wish I could say I had answers, but I don't. All I know is that something happened to us on that road, something we weren't meant to remember. There's a stretch of road I'll never drive again. A long, empty highway cutting through miles of nothing. I was on a cross-country road trip with 3 of my friends. We took turns behind the wheel, cracking jokes and living on fast food and gas station coffee. We were heading west, chasing sunsets and looking for a bit of an adventure. It was late in the afternoon when we stopped at the gas station. It looked ancient, dusty, neglected and eerily quiet. A faded sign hung above the entrance, barely visible in the dimming light. The gas station seemed to exist out of time, like it hadn't been touched in years. We were all tired, low on gas, and the air had a smell of petrol spill. The store inside was small and cramped, stocked with nothing but some stale snacks and a few drinks. There was a lone half-lit restroom outside and behind the station you'd never want to use at night. But nature was calling, and our friend Tom needed to go. He always had a small bladder, so it was no surprise he needed to use the restroom. He grabbed a bottle of water and headed towards behind the station, his footsteps disappearing into the dimming light. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. We looked at each other nervously, each of us waiting for Tom to return. He hadn't come back. We kept glancing at our phones for the time. As time got on, we one by one walked out to the back of the station, expecting to see Tom standing there laughing about how long it took to find the door or something stupid. But when we turned the corner, the restroom was different. It was boarded up. The small dingy building where a few moments ago Tom had gone to was now completely covered with large wooden planks nailed shut. We stared at the boarded up structure in disbelief. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious explanation, no footprints in the dirt, no sounds coming from inside. Panicked, we pounded on the walls, shouted his name, but there was no reply. The restroom was sealed tight. No way in, no way out. We tried to ask the old woman behind the counter about it, but her reaction was strange, blank, almost rehearsed. She just stared at us for a few moments, as if trying to place us, and then muttered something about the station being closed for the night. It didn't make sense. We were all on edge, desperately searching for some explanation, but she didn't seem to care. So we called the police. It felt like the only thing to do. We couldn't just leave, not with Tom missing. The officer who arrived seemed just as confused as we were. He inspected the area around the restroom, but there was no sign of Tom, no clue as to where he might have gone. No traces, no footprints. It was like he had vanished into thin air. We even tried to search the surrounding area, hoping we had missed something, but by the time the sun began to set, we had nothing to show for it, not even a single clue. The officer, after hours of fruitless searching, gave us a tired look and told us it was unlikely Tom was in the area. There was no evidence of foul play and nothing to explain the disappearance. He suggested we return to town, file a formal report with the authorities there, but we all knew it was hopeless. Tom wasn't coming back. After everything that had happened, we all agreed there was no point in continuing the trip. There was no use in staying in that place any longer. We packed up and cancelled the rest of the journey. No one spoke much as we got back in the car. Everyone was exhausted. The trip was over. Tom was gone. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. I know what they say about the dangers of picking up strangers, especially on desolate roads where no one would hear you scream. But that night was different. It was late, well past midnight, and I was driving back from a work trip, tired, with a long stretch of road ahead of me. The rain was hammering down, the kind that turns the world into a blur of wet asphalt and headlights, and I could hardly make out the road signs through the mist. I saw him from a distance, a figure standing alone at the side of the road, drenched and holding his thumb out. No car for miles. I could have driven past, but for some reason I didn't. Maybe it was the isolation of the road. Maybe it was the fact that he looked so damn desperate. Either way, I stopped. He didn't say a word when he got in, just nodded and sat there in the passenger seat, dripping wet, his face hidden beneath a soaked hood. I tried to make conversation, ask him where he was headed, but he didn't answer. His silence was unsettling. Maybe he'd been walking for miles and was too tired to talk. The road stretched on and on. I glanced at him every now and then, but each time he was just staring out the window. I'd look back at the road, then back at him, and it was like he hadn't even moved a muscle. The rain beat against the windows, and the sound of the engine filled the silence. We finally reached a petrol station a few miles down the road. I slowed to a stop and got out the car to fill it up. I glanced at the passenger seat. He wasn't there anymore. I blinked, confused. He hadn't said a word when I pulled up, no goodbye, nothing. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, as if he had never been in the car at all. I looked around, but the rain was coming down so hard I could barely see. The station was empty, save for a few cars parked under the awning. No sign of him anywhere. Maybe he had ducked into the station for shelter, but when I went inside it was empty apart from the attendant. There was no trace of him, not even a footprint. The weirdness didn't end there. Over the next few days, small things started going missing from my house. Nothing too valuable, but things I would definitely notice. My watch disappeared from the bedside table. Then a few days later, a jacket went missing. I started to get paranoid. I'd be walking through my flat and feel a cold draft only to find no windows open. My dog, who usually stayed close to me, started acting strange, barking at nothing, growling at corners of rooms like something was lurking just out of sight. The worst part was the feeling of being followed. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I swore I'd catch a glimpse of someone in the reflection of a window or in the shadows of an alley. But there was never anyone there. I'm sure I'm just being ridiculous. I could feel eyes on me, even when I was alone. And then, one evening, I saw something that froze me to my core. I was driving home late again, and as I passed through a quiet stretch of road, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the tarmac. My heart skipped a beat. It was him, the hitchhiker. His hood was still up, his face hidden. But I knew it was him. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. I was about to roll down the window when I saw something that stopped me cold. There was no one there. I sat there in the car, heart pounding, staring at the empty stretch of road. I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually I started the engine again and drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. The next day I checked my phone to see if I'd missed any calls or messages. There were a few, but nothing unusual. I went to the kitchen to grab a coffee, but as I walked past the mirror by the door, I froze. I could have sworn I saw someone standing behind me for a split second, just a shadow, but when I turned around, there was no one there. I started to lose track of time, unable to tell if the paranoia was getting worse or if I was just imagining things. I haven't seen the hitchhiker again, but I can feel him. I work as a freelance journalist, often chasing stories in small, out-of-the-way places. There's something about these quiet, unassuming towns that usually hides the most interesting secrets. Last week I drove to one of those towns, quaint, picturesque, the kind of place you'd see on postcards, neatly kept gardens, white picket fences, cobblestone streets. The locals were friendly, nodding and smiling as I passed. But as I wandered around taking notes and pictures, I realized there was something missing. It took a little while to click, but when it did, it hit me like a ton of bricks. There were no children, no prams, no bicycles lying in front yards, no school bell ringing. The absence was strange. A town like this should have kids playing in the streets, or at the very least some evidence that children even lived there. I tried asking a few of the locals about it, casually at first. My questions were met with polite but curt responses. A friendly no idea here, a quick change of subject there. Some people just walked away mid-conversation as though they hadn't heard me. By the end of the day, it was clear they were deliberately avoiding the topic. That night I stayed in the only inn in town. The building itself was old but charming, with creaky floorboards and a cozy fireplace in the lounge. I spent the evening going through my notes, trying to piece together some kind of explanation for what I'd noticed. Around midnight I heard it for the first time, faint laughter drifting through the open window, high-pitched and playful, unmistakably the laughter of children. It stopped me cold. I listened for a moment, then it came again, soft, distant, like it was coming from the woods that bordered the town. My curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed a torch and ventured outside. The streets were empty, eerily so, but the laughter continued, growing louder the closer I got to the edge of the woods. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but I pressed on. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting in the faint moonlight. The sound seemed to surround me, echoing through the darkness. I called out, hoping, praying it was just a group of kids sneaking out for some harmless fun. But when I reached a clearing where the laughter seemed loudest, there was nothing, just silence. No footprints in the dirt, no rustling bushes, no sign of anyone at all. I barely slept that night. The laughter continued on and off until dawn, always just on the edge of hearing, taunting me. The next morning I tried again to get answers from the locals, but their reactions were even colder than before. It was like they knew I'd heard something I wasn't supposed to. Determined to find out more, I visited the town library, hoping to dig up some history. Most of it was unremarkable: agriculture, a founding date over a century ago, nothing unusual. But then I found a local archive, tucked away in a dusty corner. It contained records of the town's population over the years, and that's where I saw a sharp decline in birth records starting about 20 years ago. It didn't make sense. There was no mention of an epidemic or any reason for such a drop. It was as though, one day, the children just stopped being born. I decided to leave that afternoon, but as I packed up my car, I noticed several townsfolk standing outside watching me. Not in a casual, neighborly way, but with cold, expressionless stares. My heart raced as I climbed into the driver's seat, their eyes following my every move. I drove out of town as fast as I could. I've spent the last few days trying to make sense of what I saw and heard. The locals, the laughter, the absence of children, it all feels like a nightmare I can't wake up from. Last night I had a dream, or at least I think it was a dream. This morning, while going to my car, I saw a small kid-size handprint on the passenger window. I've been a rideshare driver for about 3 years now. It's not the most exciting job, but it pays the bills, and every now and then I get an interesting story out of it. Last night I got one that I'll never forget, and not in a good way. It was like any other shift. A few short trips around town, ferrying people to and from pubs and restaurants. It was a quiet Tuesday night, so I wasn't expecting much traffic. At around 11 p.m. I got a ping for a pickup on the outskirts of the city, near one of those industrial areas that's mostly deserted after dark. It's not unusual to get requests from odd spots, so I didn't think much of it. When I pulled up to the location, there was a man standing under a flickering street light. He was dressed neatly, button-up shirt, trousers. Nothing out of the ordinary. He didn't have a bag or anything with him, which I thought was a little strange for the area, but people have their reasons. He climbed into the back seat without a word, and I greeted him like I usually do. He just gave me a polite nod and told me his destination. The first few minutes were silent. Some passengers like to chat, and others prefer to keep to themselves. I figured he was just the quiet type I decided to break the silence with some small talk, asking him the usual questions about his night and where he was heading. His answers were vague, really vague. Stuff like, "Just heading home," or "It's been a long day," and he didn't elaborate, and his tone was flat, almost robotic. About 10 minutes into the ride, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead. He wasn't looking at his phone or out the window, just forward. His expression was blank, and for a moment I thought I saw something in his eyes. I focused back on the road, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe it was the flickering streetlights, or maybe I was just tired. I glanced back again a few minutes later, and this time, my heart nearly stopped. The back seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The door locks were still engaged, and the car's interior was dead silent. My chest tightened as I stared at the empty seat where he'd been sitting just moments ago. I got out of the car, my legs shaky, and checked the back seat. Nothing. The road was deserted, and there was no sign of him anywhere. No footprints, no sound of footsteps retreating into the night. He was just gone. Panic started to creep in. I checked my phone for the ride details, hoping for some kind of explanation, but the app showed nothing. No record of the pickup, no fare logged, no destination. It was like the ride had never happened. I got back in the car and drove home, my hands gripping the wheels so tight they ached. The entire drive I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him sitting there again. I barely slept that night. This morning I checked the dashcam footage. The footage showed me pulling up to the pickup spot, the car idling for a minute, and then driving off with no one getting in. There was no sign of the man, no sound of a door opening or closing, just me talking to an empty car. I've been working as a paranormal investigator for over a decade. You develop a thick skin for the unexplained, shadowy figures, disembodied voices, cold spots, all the usual things. I've seen and heard plenty, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened at the farmhouse. The family reached out to us in sheer desperation. They lived on a remote farm, miles from the nearest neighbor. It had been in their family for generations. Recently, they'd started experiencing strange occurrences, doors slamming, faint talking in the night, furniture moving on its own. The youngest child, a girl no older than 8, was waking up with scratches down her back. The father swore he saw someone standing in the cornfield late at night, staring at the house. The mother claimed she felt an unseen hand grab her arm as she folded laundry. They were terrified, barely sleeping, and afraid to stay in their own home. We arrived late in the afternoon. The house had that classic countryside charm. Weathered wood, a porch swing, fields stretching endlessly into the horizon, but there was a heavy atmosphere. I felt it the moment I stepped out of the car. Inside, the family seemed genuinely relieved to see us, but their exhaustion was obvious. We set up our equipment, cameras, audio recorders, EMF detectors, and began our investigation. The first few hours were uneventful, save for a few odd noises. I thought it might be a simple residual haunting, nothing too serious. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, everything changed. The temperature in the room dropping suddenly, the faint smell of sulfur wafting through the air. Then the knocking began, coming from inside the walls. Each knock was loud, reverberating through the house. One of our team members was in the kitchen when he screamed. We ran to him, finding him pale and shaking. He said he saw a dark figure standing behind him in the reflection of the window, but when he turned around, no one was there. The family was huddled together in the living room, the children crying. We tried to calm them, but then the real horror started. The eldest child began whispering to himself. His mother asked what he was saying, but he didn't respond. Then, in a voice that was not his own, he began reciting something. It wasn't English, it sounded ancient. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed. Panic set in. The father tried to carry him to the car to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard we tried, it wouldn't open, the windows wouldn't break. It was as if the house itself was alive, holding us prisoner. Then the lights went out. In the pitch darkness, we heard a deep growl that seemed to come from everywhere. My colleague turned on his torch, its beam flickering wildly. In that brief flash of light, I saw a dark, towering figure with hollow eyes and impossibly long limbs standing at the end of the hallway. We backed into the living room, trying to keep everyone together. The growling grew louder, more menacing. The air felt like it was vibrating. The cameras we'd set up began to malfunction, their feeds cutting to static. One of our team members began praying. The figure stepped closer. I tried to hold my ground, but fear gripped me in a way I'd never experienced before. The figure stopped just short of the circle we'd formed. It raised one arm and pointed at the mother. She let out a blood-curdling scream and collapsed to the floor, writhing as if in pain. We acted on instinct, reciting every protective prayer and chant we knew. The figure recoiled slightly, its form flickering like a dying flame. It let out an ear-piercing screech before vanishing, leaving the house in complete silence. The door unlocked. The family didn't hesitate. They ran to their car and sped away. We packed up what we could and followed. The family moved away and refused to talk about what happened. We reviewed the footage later. Most of it was corrupted, but one camera caught a clear shot of the figure. It wasn't human. I don't investigate anymore. That house changed me. It seemed like the perfect opportunity at the time. My family was struggling to make ends meet, bills piling up, endless stress, and then this job came along. Winter caretaker for a remote high-end hotel nestled deep in the mountains. The pay was decent, and the idea of getting away from everything for a few months sounded like a dream. My wife wasn't thrilled, but she understood we needed the money. She stayed back with the kids while I went off to play groundskeeper in the snow. The hotel was beautiful, if not a little eerie. A grand old building with creaking floors and long, echoing hallways. It was off-peak season, so only a skeleton crew of staff and a handful of guests were there for the winter holidays. I didn't know at the time, but once the weather turned, the snowstorms would isolate us completely. No roads in or out, no phone signals, just us and the hotel until spring. The first week or so was uneventful. I was tasked with general maintenance, checking the boiler, keeping the paths clear, basic stuff. The guests were polite but kept to themselves, and the staff were friendly enough. I spent most evenings reading by the fire or exploring the building's maze of hallways. Then the storms hit. It was kind of magical. Thick snow falling in curtains, blanketing everything in silence. But it didn't stop. Days passed and the snow piled higher and higher. Soon the windows on the lower floors were completely covered, and the hotel felt more like a tomb than a luxury retreat. It was around this time that I started noticing things. One night, while making my rounds, I saw someone standing at the end of a hallway. A shadowy figure just standing there. I called out, but they didn't move. When I approached, they were gone. I searched the nearby rooms, but they were empty. The next morning, I tried to shake it off as my imagination, but things only got worse. The guests began complaining about strange noises, tapping on their walls. One of the housekeepers quit on the spot after claiming to see someone in her mirror who wasn't there when she turned around. And the dreams. I started having vivid, terrifying dreams of the hotel's corridors stretching endlessly, the walls closing in and voices whispering my name. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. Some nights I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming or awake. And one night I woke up to find the entire hotel plunged into darkness. The power had gone out and the storm outside was howling. I grabbed a torch and started heading towards the basement to check the generator. As I descended the stairs, I swear I heard someone breathing just behind me. When I turned, there was no one there, In the basement, I found the generator was fine, but footprints from the coal soot leading away from the boiler and into a dark room no one goes into. I backed out of the room and didn't go down there again. The isolation started to get to all of us. The guests were irritable, snapping at each other over nothing. The staff avoided me, whispering to each other when they thought I wasn't listening. I couldn't blame them. I wasn't myself. I'd started talking to myself, hearing things no one else could hear. And then people began disappearing. First, it was one of the guests. We thought she'd gone outside and gotten lost in the storm, but there were no tracks in the snow. Then one of the kitchen staff vanished, leaving her station mid-shift. We searched every room, every corner of the hotel, but there was no trace of them. By now, no one was sleeping. The whispers had grown louder, echoing through the halls at all hours. Sometimes I'd see shadows moving just at the edge of my vision, only to find nothing when I turned. The others started accusing me of losing it, of being the one behind the disappearances. I couldn't argue with them. I was losing it. The hotel was playing with us. I began to wonder if the others were even real, or if I was trapped here alone. One night I woke to find myself standing in the grand dining room holding a knife. I didn't remember how I got there or why I had the knife, but the room was empty, silent except for the storm outside. By the time spring came and the roads reopened, I was the only one left. The rescue team found me wandering the snow-covered grounds, muttering to myself. They asked about the others, but I couldn't explain. It had been years since we all got together. Life had pulled us in different directions. So when the opportunity came to reunite for a weekend away, we all jumped at it. A cabin in the middle of nowhere, secluded and quiet. No distractions, no work. Just us, the woods, and the endless stream of memories to reminisce about. The drive up was filled with laughter, old jokes, and plenty of catching up. We all knew we'd be back to our usual selves within minutes. There's something about being with old friends that feels like no time has passed. We reached the cabin just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. It was exactly how we imagined it. Rustic, remote, and for some reason, a little eerie. We settled in, cracked open a few drinks, and started reminiscing. The atmosphere was perfect. Everyone was in good spirits. Tim, our friend who had been the life of the party back in the day, didn't seem himself. He'd forget the names of places we had talked about earlier, or he'd space out mid-sentence. We didn't think much of it. He'd been through a lot in recent years, and maybe the stress of life had finally caught up with him. But as the night wore on, it got worse. He started staring off into the corner of the room, his gaze vacant, his hands twitching nervously. When we called his name, it was like he didn't hear us. His eyes would snap back to focus, but it was obvious something wasn't right. He didn't seem like himself, not completely. We joked about it, making light of the situation, but by the time the fire crackled down to embers, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. Around midnight, we all settled down in our respective rooms. I was sharing with Dave, and I noticed Tim wasn't in the living room where he had been earlier. He was gone. We didn't think much of it, assuming he had gone to bed early or was off doing something on his own, but the next morning, when we all gathered for breakfast, he still wasn't there. No sign of him at all. By the time lunch came and went, there was still no sign of him. His bag was still in his room, his jacket hung on the hook by the door. Things were out of place, but there was no real reason to panic yet. After all, it was a large cabin in the woods, and he could have gone for a walk or even taken a nap outside. But then things started to get strange. Dave mentioned that he thought Tim had been acting a bit odd last night too. But then he paused and added, Was he here last night? I don't remember him being around. By evening, we started looking around for him. We called out, walked the property, checked the nearby woods, but there was no sign. The others started to question if he was ever even there in the first place. We dismissed it as panic. But when we began piecing things together, doubts started creeping in. We couldn't remember the exact moment when Tim had started acting weird. We couldn't agree on when he'd stopped being him. His presence had been there, but was it really him? We sat around the fire that night in complete silence, each of us trying to remember, to find that one moment where we could say for sure that we had seen him, but all we could recall were blurry fragments, images of a man who had been with us but now seemed distant, as if the memory of him was already fading. Then the real horror began. None of us remembered ever seeing Tim leave. Not one of us could pinpoint when he disappeared. It was as if, all along, he had never really been there. The others were growing increasingly agitated, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Could it be possible? Had Tim truly never existed, or had we all just lost our minds in that cabin? In the morning, it all reached a boiling point. We gathered in the living room to leave, and that's when I found Tim's jacket, his belongings, everything was gone. There were no signs of him, no indication that he had ever been there. We packed up quickly, trying to put the nightmare behind us. As we left the cabin, I glanced back, half expecting to see Tim standing in the doorway, but there was nothing. Just the emptiness of the woods, stretching on for miles. We haven't spoken much since. We all still remember that weekend, the laughter, the good times, and the strange disappearance of our friend. There's something uniquely thrilling about seeing a city from above. The chaos below reduced to neat grids, the ant-like scurry of people, the toy cars crawling along tiny roads. My friends and I had been backpacking across the country, checking off every famous landmark we could squeeze into our itinerary. That's how we ended up at one of the tallest skyscrapers in the city, standing in the queue for its glass-walled elevator that promised a jaw-dropping ascent to the viewing platform. The group of us, 5 in total, were in high spirits. We joked, took selfies, and argued over who'd get the best spot by the window. When the elevator doors slid open, we piled in eagerly. I pressed the button for the top floor, and we began our smooth ascent. The city unfolded beneath us as we climbed. The chatter in the elevator grew louder, voices overlapping with laughter. That's when the lights flickered. It was brief, maybe a second or two, but enough to plunge the elevator into total darkness. The hum of the motor cut out, leaving us in silence. Then, just as suddenly, the lights came back and the motor resumed its steady whir. We all nervously laughed it off. A power surge, maybe. It was only when someone asked, "Where's Ben?" that the mood shifted. Ben was gone. The elevator wasn't huge. It wasn't possible for someone to get off without us noticing. He had just disappeared. We were all panicking. One of my friends pressed the emergency button, but there was no response, only static through the speaker. The viewing platform was just a few floors away, so we decided to wait, hoping someone would be able to help us sort this out when we reached the top. But when the elevator doors opened, there was no viewing platform. Instead, we were staring into an empty concrete room. No windows, no signs of life, just a long, dark expanse of cement stretching in every direction. One of my friends reached out hesitantly, but the second their hand crossed the elevator door, the lights flickered again. This time it was longer, maybe 5 seconds. When the lights returned, another friend was gone. We screamed. I pounded on the buttons, slamming the emergency alarm over and over. The elevator didn't budge. The numbers on the display flickered, cycling through nonsensical combinations. I couldn't breathe. The 3 of us left, huddled together, backs pressed against the cold metal of the elevator wall, as if that could somehow keep us safe. None of us dared to move. The next flicker came without warning. This time it was me who turned around to find one fewer person. There were only 2 of us left now. The silence was unbearable. My friend, my last remaining companion, grabbed my arm, their grip almost painfully tight. The elevator lurched up. When the doors opened again, I was alone. I didn't step out. I couldn't. Instead, I slammed the closed door button, hoping against hope that it would do something, anything. The doors shut and the elevator began to move again. When it finally stopped, the doors opened to the ground floor. The lobby was the same as when we'd entered, bustling with tourists, attendants, and staff. I stumbled out, disoriented and shaking. No one paid me any attention. It was like I didn't exist. I ran to the desk, screaming about my friends, but the attendant only gave me a confused look. I asked for security footage, proof that we'd entered the elevator together, but when they pulled it up, the footage showed me stepping in alone. This all started as something harmless. I've always been fascinated by technology, especially cybersecurity. I'm that kid in class who could bypass the school's firewall to watch YouTube or access blocked sites. It wasn't about causing trouble, it was about the thrill of figuring things out. Naturally, this led me down rabbit holes on the internet, and eventually I heard about the dark web. It was all just curiosity. I wasn't planning to do anything illegal. I wanted to see what it was all about, like peering into a forbidden part of the world. I downloaded Tor, followed guides to stay anonymous, and cautiously browsed the dark web. It was mostly underwhelming. Outdated forums, links that didn't work, and scams everywhere. Then I found the link. It wasn't flashy, just a simple string of text in a forum post buried under countless threads. It promised a look into the hidden world. Stupidly, I clicked it. What loaded wasn't what I expected. No drugs, no stolen credit cards. It was worse. It was a live stream. The screen was dark, except for a small countdown timer in the corner. It read 5 minutes. Below it, a chat box scrolled with messages. I couldn't make out most of it. It was in different languages, but occasionally I'd see something like, "Lot number 3, very young, good condition." The countdown hit 0 and the screen flickered. A figure appeared, standing behind a podium in a poorly lit room. They were masked, their voice distorted, but what they were saying was clear. They were auctioning off people. My stomach twisted as the first lot was dragged into view. A young woman, blindfolded and gagged, her hands tied behind her back. The chat box exploded. Bids started rolling in, flashing across the screen in chilling precision. I wanted to shut it off, but I couldn't look away. It was like my body had locked up in sheer terror. As the auction continued, the lots became even more horrifying. Children, elderly people. All of them terrified, all of them objects for the monsters in the chat to bid on. I didn't understand how something so horrific could even exist. Then the screen glitched for a moment. Static buzzed and the video cut out. When it returned, the auctioneer wasn't at the podium anymore. Instead, on the screen was me. My webcam was broadcasting me to the whole auction. The auctioneer's distorted voice came back, reading out my IP address, then my name, then my exact location. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The chat box erupted again, but this time the messages were different. They were bidding on me. The camera feed switched again, this time showing a live view of my house. I could see my bedroom window from the outside, the faint glow of my computer screen visible through the curtains. They were here. I slammed my laptop shut and yanked the power cord. It didn't matter. The damage was done. My phone buzzed on my desk, the caller ID flashing unknown. I didn't answer, but a text came through moments later. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, jumping into my car. My brain was on autopilot, screaming at me to get as far away as possible. I didn't even know where I was going, just away. My phone kept buzzing, each text more threatening than the last. They knew everything, my family, my friends, my routine. I drove for hours, paranoia eating away at me. Every pair of headlights in my rearview mirror felt like them. Every shadow on the roadside seemed to move. Eventually, I ended up in a motel in the middle of nowhere. I paid in cash and bolted the door, sitting with my back against it, clutching a knife from the room's kitchenette. It's been 3 days. I haven't dared to contact anyone. My phone is off, but I can still feel them watching. Sometimes I hear footsteps outside the room late at night, but when I look, no one's there. Last night, someone slipped a note under my door. It just said, "We found you."